We're actually continuing today the second in a series on the things that God has built. And we talked about last week the home. Today we're going to talk about government. Of course, we know as we consider what we talked about last week, Hebrews tells us that the builder of all things is God. So we know God made everything. Everything that we have is from God. But specifically, we talk about the fact that He made three institutions, three organizations to be part of our human existence here on earth. One of those was the home, the family. And so we talked about that one and how God made the family. And we talked about that last week. And you can certainly go back to our YouTube channel and check that out if you missed that. But today we want to continue on and move further into looking at God's institution of government. In Romans chapter 13, in verses 3 and 4, among some other things that Paul says about government there, he says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the evildoer." Well, this passage tells us that government is a servant of God. At least that's what government is supposed to be. And so we want to look as we get into this lesson today then, first of all, at what God wanted government to be. I want to look at that first. What was God's plan? What does God want it to be like? And it may surprise us that while God certainly has a plan for government, it's not a hugely extravagant plan for government. The thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of laws that our country's government, not to mention the state and local governments adding all their rules and regulations and things to that wasn't God's original plan. In fact, realize God made a nation, and we're going to talk about that nation in a little bit. But God made a nation, and He made laws for that nation. They're in our Bibles. All of the laws for that nation are contained in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy is kind of a review of what's in those three. Those three books that are part of our Bible was the whole of the law for His land, for His nation, for His kingdom. That was it in the Old Testament. Now, next week we're going to talk about another thing that He established and instituted, and that's the church, which is itself a kingdom, and we'll talk about that next time. But today we're focusing on secular government, human government. And as we think about this, we want to mention a few of these passages. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 12 says, "I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and I find knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil, pride and arrogance, and the way of evil and perverted speech I hate. I have counsel and sound wisdom. I have insight. I have strength." Notice verse 15. "By me kings reign." Now this is wisdom personified here. But this is actually God speaking about how important wisdom is. "By me kings reign and rulers decree what is just. By me princes rule and nobles and all who govern justly." So the first thing that God wanted from government was wisdom. And of course, wisdom that comes from God. Unfortunately, many governments throw away God, push him aside and his wisdom aside, and think they know better. We talked about with the family last week how many times we think, well, we know better than what God does, and we'll do it our way, and we can make the family better than God designed it. And people do the same thing with government, and we'll talk about some of the ways they do that in a little bit as well. Then in 1 Kings chapter 3, and verses 5 through 10, Solomon has become king. He's about to become king. And God appears to him and talks to him about what he wants. And you ask anything and I'll give it to you to help you govern the people. He could have asked for wealth, he could have asked for fame, he could have asked for all these different things. But of course, the Bible tells us that Solomon asked for wisdom. He says, your servant, down in verse 8, your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people? And so Solomon understood the need for that wisdom, that understanding, to be a good leader, to be able to guide the people in the way they should go. Then we find also in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verses 2 through 4. The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. This is David speaking. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass sprout from the earth. Here in 2 Samuel, David points out that when somebody who's governing, who's ruling, does it justly, when they do it in the right way, when they do it in the fear of the Lord, that's a beautiful thing. It's like a beautiful sunrise. You like to see a beautiful sunrise? I don't like to be up early enough to see a beautiful sunrise, but at least if I'm up that early, I get to see a beautiful sunrise. It's at least worth it a little bit. But that's beautiful when the sun rises. And what about when the rain falls, makes the plants grow? He says, good government is like that. Throughout Proverbs, it talks about when rulers do what's right versus when rulers do what's wrong, and why certain people shouldn't rule because of the way they would mishandle it and things like that. And it talks about how the people rejoice when the righteous rule, when justice is being done, when people are being treated properly by government. People rejoice in that. That's what God wanted from government. And he gives a little bit of that plan. Let's look back at Romans 13 and verses 3 and 4 that we mentioned in the introduction a moment ago. Consider that for just a second again. Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Now, the amazing thing about that statement in and of itself is that Paul is writing this during a time when Christians were being persecuted by the governing authorities. And yet he says the rulers, this is the way God designed it, rulers aren't to be a terror to those who are doing what's good and what's right. He says, do what's good. You'll receive the approval from the one in authority. But if you do wrong, be afraid. He does not bear the sword in vain. And what is a sword used for? You don't use a sword to slice bread. You don't use a sword to slap somebody on the wrist. Sword's used for one thing and one thing only. It's there to kill, to put to death. And so Paul says, yes, the government has this as part of what's built into it by God, is that it is there to punish the wicked to the point of execution. There are a lot of people who, capital punishment, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't be like that and put people to death. Paul says, yeah, that's part of what God instituted government to do, is to put people to death who deserved it. In fact, Paul himself, when he was on trial, he said, if I have done anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. He said, there are some things that are worthy of death, and if I've done one of those things, then put me to death. He says that the government is God's servant to carry out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. There's not a whole lot more beyond that. Now, there are some other things, certainly, that he goes on to talk about taxation. Certainly the government has the right to tax. Jesus, had them bring him the coin. Well, whose face is on there? Well, that's the face of the Caesar, so give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Pay your taxes. They have the right to do that. And God, when he established a nation, he established taxes as part of that nation that he built as well. But a lot of the things that people fuss and fight about what government does or is doing or is going to do or they want government to do, are things that are really outside of what God intended. God said, really, government has one purpose. And of course, they have to tax the people to be able to afford to fulfill that purpose. But their purpose is this: approve of the good and punish the wicked. If a government is accomplishing that task, if they're upholding what is right and punishing the evildoers for what is wrong, then they're doing what God wants. Now, well, what about the economic status of that? That's not part of it. That's not what God didn't establish the government for economic purposes. Now, the Bible does tell us, when there is righteousness in government, the righteousness is going to exalt a nation and there are going to be benefits from that. He told his people if they'd follow his laws, then they wouldn't be poor and, they wouldn't be invaded and all these kinds of things. There would be some periphery benefits to following God's plan for government. But God's plan for government was pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It didn't matter how good the government was doing at all the other things that governments get involved in, if they're not standing for justice. We have that in our Pledge of Allegiance in our country, and justice for all. That's what God intended for government to be, justice for all. Defend the innocent. Punish the wicked. Pretty straightforward, really, when you think about it. It's not the government's job to build roads, not the government's job to give economic incentives to business. It's not the government's. I mean, you go on down the list of things. Now, I mean, if people want to get their government together to do those things, they can do all those things, but that's not what God's plan was. God's plan was, you need government to make sure that the innocent are protected and the guilty are punished. And our country, like a lot of others, is so concerned with so many other things that we're forgetting that basic one. Our government isn't protecting the innocent. When we have 1 million abortions a year, you can't get much more innocent than a baby. And they're not being protected. Government's not doing its job. They're not protecting the innocent. That's a problem. Secondly, we want to notice God's government is best. I mean, that should be obvious. God's perfect, so He's going to have the best ideas. He's going to have the perfect ideas, in fact. Job chapter 34 and verse 12 through 19. Elihu is come on the scene after Job and his friends have been arguing back and forth. And Elihu comes in and says, okay, let me stand up for God here. They're all talking back and forth about this. And he said, hey, let me tell you about God. Truly, God will not do wickedly. The Almighty will not pervert justice. You know, sometimes people get special treatment. They're rich, they're famous, they're one race or another, and so they get treated differently and they get special treatment. God's not gonna, if He's going to be just, He's going to treat everyone properly, and everyone will be judged by the same standards. It's not, you're not going to be able to buy Him off. Who gave Him charge over the earth, and who laid on Him the whole world? Well, nobody gave Him charge. He created it. He just got charge of it. If He should set His heart to it and gather to Himself His spirit and His breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to the dust. He tells you, you can't stand before God. You would not be able to survive. If you have understanding, hear this. Listen to what I say. Shall one who hates justice govern? Will you condemn him who is righteous and mighty, who says to a king, worthless one, and to nobles, wicked man, who shows no partiality to princes, nor regards the rich more than the poor, for they are all the work of His hands? He says, there's no partiality with God. He'll stand up to the king and say, you're worthless. And he did by His prophets on many occasions in old Israel. He told those kings, you're disobeying God. You're wicked. You're evil. Ahab accused Elijah of being the one who troubled Israel. And Elijah said, no. You and your family, your household, you're the ones that have caused all this trouble in Israel. You're off worshiping all these idols, not worshiping God, not following Him. But Elihu makes it clear, all of us, from the richest to the poorest, from the highest government official anywhere on earth, down to the lowliest slave on earth, we're all made by His hand. And He'll be sure justice is done. Genesis 12, 1 and 2. God said to Abraham, go from your country and from your kindred and from your father's house to the land I'll show you, and I will make of you a great nation. God had this plan. He was going to make a great nation out of Abraham's family. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. God made Abraham's descendants into a nation so that they would bless others. That's why He took Abraham. He said, Abraham, I want you to be a blessing to others. and I'm going to take your descendants. I'm going to make a great nation, and it's going to be a blessing to others. A nation following God's ways is going to bless others. A government that follows God's ways is going to be a blessing on others. Deuteronomy 4, 6 through 8, we mentioned this briefly earlier. He's giving them the law. He's talking to them about the commandments. And he says, keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Because of their laws. Because their laws were just. You know, when we go back and we read the law of Moses, we realize that the fundamentals of that law, as far as the treatment of the people who were under that law from a government standpoint, is we haven't improved on that in 3,000 years. No other government has made any government that treats people, that makes statutes and laws that are any better than those. He says, for what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today? Now, Leviticus, of course, deals mainly with the religious side of Israel's culture. But the law of Moses, Exodus, and some is taught in Numbers and Deuteronomy as well, some things along those lines that are kind of add to what was in Exodus. It's a very simple law. It's a very basic law. But its simplicity is its wisdom. It didn't have to be complicated to be good and to be right. God gave them a great name. Who else has statutes and rules that are so righteous as the law that they got? But of course, man abused God's plan. Time and again, man tries to come up with his own ways of doing things. And this really started all the way back in Genesis, when God created Adam and Eve, and he was their government. I mean, they're just one family. They didn't need a whole lot of government at that point. But he was their government. And then as they increased, he continued to be the ruling authority. And he talked to the patriarchs, the fathers of the families, talked to them about how to rule their families. And that was as far as government went until after the flood, as far as we know. We don't read about any human governments beyond just the fathers talking to God until after the flood. In Genesis chapter 10, we see the first case of a human government that tried to improve on God's plan. Genesis 10 and verse 8, Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom. This is the first time in the Bible we read about a kingdom. Here is Nimrod's kingdom. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. That sound familiar? Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Babel in the land of Shinar, the first human kingdom that we read about. The first time that man said, we don't want you to rule over us, God. We're going to rule over ourselves. We got this figured out. And what did they do there? God had told them after the flood to scatter out and refill the earth. And what did they do instead? They gathered in one place. They said, lest we be scattered on the earth. In other words, we're going to do exactly the opposite of what God said. He said, go scatter. We're going to stay here in one place. And Nimrod built his kingdom. And they built a tower to go up to heaven. And they rebelled against God. And God just crushed it. He scattered them. But we see it right there in Genesis 10, the first time that human beings tried to fix God's plan for governing them. And then we see it also in Matthew 10, 16 through 18. Jesus says that his followers are going to be delivered to courts. They're going to be flogged in the synagogues. They're going to be dragged before governors and kings as evildoers, even though they're not evildoers. Again, man corrupting. Instead of punishing the wicked, they're doing wickedness. Instead of standing for justice and what is right, they're punishing someone who did no wrong, as they did with Jesus himself, obviously. They killed him. And we see the same thing, 1 Samuel 8 and verses 5 through 7. The people come to Samuel, who is God's prophet, who's been serving the people. And they said, you're old and your sons aren't doing a good job. They're not like you, so give us a king. Samuel was upset. He went to the Lord and prayed to the Lord about it. And the Lord said, you know what? Do what they said. They haven't rejected you. They've rejected me from being king over them. God finds this people that he had suffered so much for, bringing them out of the land of Egypt, bringing them into the promised land. All this he'd done for them. And what's the thanks he gets? We want a man to be our king instead of you, God. That's what he got. They rejected him. Man, just like in the case of the family, here in the case of government, man is trying to do it their own way instead of God's way. But God is still in control. He gave them a king, but he was still in control. He sets up kings. He brings kings down. He is in control. Jeremiah 51, verses 20 through 25. We won't read the whole thing because we're running out of time. But he basically says to Babylon, you're my weapon, and I'm going to use you to destroy all these other nations. But then after that, he says, I'm against you, and I'm going to destroy you. So he says, I'm going to use you as a weapon to destroy the others, and then I'm going to turn around and destroy you. God's in control. Daniel chapter 4, verses 24 and 25. Nebuchadnezzar had the dream about the tree getting chopped down. And Daniel says, this is the interpretation. You're going to be driven from among men. Your dwelling's going to be with the beasts of the field. Till 7 periods of time pass over you, probably 7 years. Perhaps 7 seasons, but seven periods of time will pass over. Till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whoever he will. God's in control. Now understand, that doesn't mean God always gives the governance to the best individual. I mean, we can look back at history and we can see some of the government. I mean, some horrible governments throughout history. But just like with Israel, sometimes God gives the people what they want. He just said, you want it that bad? Here. I'll give you the king you want, and you'll get what you deserve. So we need to be aware of that. Now, certainly, the people didn't necessarily vote on kings. as such, although sometimes they fought wars over who was going to get to be the king and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, God let them have sometimes good kings, sometimes bad, but often based on where they as a group of people were, where they as a nation were, and what they thought they wanted. He let them have it. And He'll let us have whoever we vote for too. Because that's the way our government is set up. We vote for who our leaders are, so we get what we deserve. Now, I know sometimes, well, I didn't vote for that guy, or I didn't vote for her, or I didn't, well, yeah, but if there's enough people in that nation that do want that, they get that. And sometimes, yes, sometimes the righteous will suffer even as a result. But how does God want us to interact with government? Real quick, because we are out of time, but we'll just real quick. First, there in Romans 13, 1 through 7, I know we've heard this before, but let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Don't rebel. Obey them. Just as Jesus told his disciples, whatever the scribes and Pharisees tell you to do, you do it because they're sitting in Moses' seat. They're in the seat of authority. You may not like it, but as long as it doesn't violate God's commands, you submit to it. Now, in our nation, of course, we're able to petition the government for change. We can vote to get new leaders in there to change those laws if we don't like them, and that's not rebellion. We're still in subjection to them. But we are to be in subjection to them. He said, there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Government is instituted by God. Now again, sometimes He uses wicked leadership to punish wicked people. So whoever resists the authority is resisting what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. There are a lot of people in this world that need to learn that lesson. There's going to be a lot of rebellion and strife in this world of people rising up against governments and overthrowing governments and various different things. We need to take a long look at David. Once he had been anointed to be king, he still would not lift up his hand against Saul. He waited for God to remove Saul for him to take his place. Be careful. When you're resisting the authority, you may incur God's judgment and wrath. He says this, of course, verse 6 there, because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. I've not met a whole lot of people who really like taxes. Honestly, I don't even think the people that work at the IRS and collect the taxes really like the taxes. I mean, it's a job for them. They make money out of it, but I don't think they like it either. It's a big hassle. It's a big headache for them. They don't really like it, but they got to do it. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. And then 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Again, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. As Christians in any nation that we find ourselves in, wherever it is, whether it's communist China or whether it's the freedom of a democratic-style government, republic here in the United States, or anywhere, under a monarchy, under a dictator, it doesn't matter, wherever we find ourselves, if we're Christians, we should be living so good, we should be such good citizens that anyone who tries to speak against us is put to shame. Do we do that? Are we living like that? Are we interacting with government like that? Live as people who are free, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up to do evil. But live as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. And honor the emperor or the king. Or, of course, we don't have emperors and kings, but honor those that are in authority over us. That doesn't mean we agree with everything they do. We may still disagree with them. We may still say, they were not right to do that. That was wrong. That was sinful. That was wicked. We can still say that, but still give them the honor because of their position as a position of authority. And know that, of course, they're not going to be perfect because they're human beings. As we conclude, though, we want to look forward to next week. We're going to talk about one other government. Isaiah 9, 6 through 7 prophesied about a government that was coming. This is actually the only two places in the Bible that the word government is actually used in the English translation. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. His name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Isaiah looked forward to a time when there was a new government, a new form of government, something different than had ever been seen before. We're fortunate enough to live during that time. And we're going to look at that next week as we look at that child that was born, the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, and his government. And we'll look at that next week. If you're here and you need to respond to God's invitation for any reason, if perhaps you've rebelled against government and governing authorities in your life, whether it be secular government, whether it be in your family, whether it be on the job, wherever, if you're rebelling against authority, it's time to submit to that authority. If you're here and you're not a Christian, you need to submit to God's authority. Believe in him, repent of your sins, confess Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, be buried with him in baptism to wash your sins away. If you're here and you have a need to respond, please do so as we stand and as we sing.